the lot of the songs are actually Urdu, not Hindi. Yeah, doesn't necessarily mean blind faith. So uh, Augustine and Anselm, to just give you some examples. Augustine and Anselm. Augustine defined as faith seeking understanding. I think it's okay. They okay Bhagavad Gita? I don't know. See. Yeah, so he defines faith seeking understanding. So in other words, faith is something that you try to understand. It's not blind faith. So Richard Dawkins defines faith as blind faith, and therefore he rejects it because his science always asks questions. Religion, blind faith. So that's a wrong definition. No theologian would define faith as blind faith. And I've often said this, that you ask a lot of questions in theology. I think theology is born when people ask questions. Religion is born when they ask questions. When Jesus said, "Who do people say that I am?" Buddhism was born with questions. So religion is born with questions, and yet people like Richard Dawkins. The thing that I was very much disappointed with the History Channel episode was that it's a History Channel, so they should have invited a historian of science, rather than just a scientist. Because it's a History Channel. It's a History Channel. So a history of science. So they should have got a historian of science who would look at history. And if you study history, you will know that the relationship between science and religion, there are 4 relationships between science and religion. And only one of it is conflict. But Richard Dawkins, who is not a historian of science, so he cannot talk about it, with authority. Colin Blackmore, the one who was in the History Channel, he also says it by nature must always be one of conflict. But that's only one relationship. And the most famous example is Galileo. But Galileo, was a Christian. So he was a Christian. He believed in the Bible. But after he discovered that the sun is in the center and it's the earth that moves around, he still believed in the Bible. But unfortunately many people thought that the Pope, during the time of Galileo, the Pope was a friend of Galileo. So the Pope thought that the Bible teaches that the earth is at the center. But nowhere the Bible teaches that the earth is the center. Nowhere the Bible teaches that the earth is the center of the solar system. Nowhere does the Bible teach that it is the sun that goes around the earth. It doesn't teach. So we should be very careful to say things that the Bible doesn't say. And so Galileo, during the time of Galileo, the churches believed, or the Roman Catholic Church believed in Aristotle. If Aristotle said something, then it must be right. Okay. And the second is, they thought that the Bible teaches, like for example, they thought that the Bible teaches that the universe is 6,000 years old. But nowhere does the Bible teach that the universe is 6,000 years old. The Genesis story that's not the point of the Genesis story. The Genesis story tells why the universe was created, and it tells about God actively involved in the creation. Should not be taken literally. It's not a literal 6 days. That's not the point. It's more like poetry. And we have discussed that, that in our class. It's more like in the form of a story. It's much more interesting than a science textbook. So Genesis 1 is not a science textbook. And so we should not read it as science. And we should not go to, in our modern arrogance, which Vinod Ramachandra says, that in our modern arrogance, we should not go to the text of Genesis and demand from the author answers to questions the author is not asking. So you cannot go to Genesis 1 and demand answers to modern questions. That's not what Genesis is trying to answer. So you need to try to find out what is the purpose of Genesis. So you don't read it literally, you read it literarily. So you find what is the literary purpose, and so we don't have time for, that. But Galileo was the Medicis, which was the richest family in Italy. He's been to Italy, so he's coming from Venice, but the Medicis, the Medicis were not from Venice, they were from Florence, but they were the richest family. So they invited Galileo to teach their children, educate their children. And so Galileo, he was a scientist, but he was also a very interesting guy. Usually scientists are often very boring. They were. But Galileo used to be the life of the party. When they used to come and sit in a table, during parties and banquets, Galileo, there used to be apples, there used to be grapes and all kinds of things. So Galileo used to ask, if I take an apple and if I take a grape in my two hands, and if I leave it from the same height, which would hit the table sooner, And of course, they say, of course, the apple, because, common sense, it's heavier, it's bigger, so it will fall faster. And then the second reason they would give is because Aristotle said, that, the heavier the object, it should hit the earth, sooner. And so they said that. So he said, so Galileo said, I know Aristotle said it, and it seems to make common sense. But still, let us test it. So he takes the apple in one hand, he takes the grape in one hand, and from the same height he lets it go, and both hits the same time. They are shocked. And so pretty soon, especially the ladies, they are testing. So they're taking apples, they're taking other round fruits, different sizes, different shapes, and they're throwing. It hits the same. So very soon, instead of eating, they're playing with their food. Yeah. I don't know what happened because there's no more food, but there's a rich family, no problem for food. Yes. So yeah. Yeah, no, we can try it. But so they found out what Aristotle taught is not true. So Aristotle makes mistakes. Because during that time, even Christians believed, if Aristotle said it, that's final. And so, but Aristotle, I like Aristotle. Aristotle's philosophy, I find many of it attractive. But the problem with Aristotle was, and the problem with the Greek scientists, were they believed in rational speculation and assumption rather than observation. Okay, so they assumed that beyond the moon, all the planets are going in perfect circles. So all the planets beyond the moon, because Aristotle assumed that everything beyond the moon is perfect. And then Aristotle assumed that the circle is the perfect figure. So putting those two things together, he said everything beyond the moon should be moving in perfect circles, perfect orbits, all the planets. Okay, so people believed in Aristotle. Actually, Aristotle thought that women have more teeth than men. I don't know, yeah. All he had to do was ask Mrs. Aristotle to open his mouth and counted. But anyway, but that was Aristotle's view. Now Galileo and Kepler, see, this is very interesting. Galileo and Kepler and others who were Christians said, wait a minute, we believe in a personal God, and a personal God created the universe in a particular way. Let's find out how he created it. And that's how modern science was born. Very different from Aristotle. Aristotle assumed, he assumed certain things. But these early Christians who were scientists said, wait a minute, let's find out. God, a personal God, created the world in a particular way. Let's find out. That's why modern science was born, because of a Christian worldview. Even non-Christian historians agree with that. Alexander Whitehead, who is not a Christian philosopher, he says that modern science would not have been born without a Christian worldview. Robert Oppenheimer, who was the guy, he was the head of the Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project was the project where they tested the atom bomb in the deserts of New Mexico. He was the head of that project that tested the atom bomb, and later it was used in Japan, in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But it was tested in the United States in the deserts of New Mexico. And so when he tested it, when the mushroom cloud came, Robert Oppenheimer quoted a verse from the Bhagavad Gita. Man, from a Hindu scripture. Robert Oppenheimer, he felt that, that this detonation of the atom bomb, the only thing, he felt what was relevant would be a Hindu scripture. He was not a Christian, but he also believed that, modern science was born because of a Christian worldview. So even though there were Chinese science and Indian science that was better than European science in the ancient world and the Middle Ages, but in the modern world, it was from a Christian worldview. So all the scientists were Christians in the 16th, 17th century. Copernicus, who first said, that it's the sun that is in the center. Before that, many people thought that the earth is the center, and they wrongly thought that the Bible is teaching that. Again, as I said, the Bible doesn't teach that. So anyway, but they, felt it. Copernicus was a deacon. He was a Roman Catholic deacon. Galileo, so Galileo said Copernicus was right. And Galileo was the one who proved Copernicus's theory. Copernicus did not come up with a proof. That's why it's called Copernicus theory. Copernicus came up with the theory based on some mathematical equations where he felt it seems like the sun is the center and not the earth. But he did not come up with any proof. The proof came from Galileo, because by the time of Galileo there were telescopes that was invented. So he was able to use the telescopes, and he studied the planets, he studied Jupiter and things like that, and he found out, he proved Copernicus was right. But the church had, Copernicus lived about 60 or 70 years before Galileo. So Copernicus was, he was tried for heresy, and the church said that he is a heretic. So now Galileo is saying that Copernicus was right. But the church already said Copernicus is a heretic. So what do you do with Galileo? So they arrested Galileo and they brought him in front of a tribunal, judges, Inquisition, and they told him to reject Copernicus's view. And so he is in his 70s. Galileo, he has arthritis, rheuma, and he's in house arrest, and they have this this machine which they clamp around your head. They put it around your head, and they would and they have, as part of the gadget, they have something that kind of a needle that will press against your tongue so that you cannot curse the church when you are dying. In the last moment, you cannot curse the church. So he knew. So he saw that gadget, and it's not a very nice gadget. He's old. He has rheuma and arthritis. So they told him to say that Copernicus was a heretic. So he said, yeah, Copernicus was an idiot. He said Copernicus was wrong. And then, so they let him go. But as he was leaving, the judges are sitting there. As he was leaving, he stamped the earth with his foot, and he said, "But it moves." Yeah, meaning the earth moves. But he said it under his breath. They did not hear it. If they heard it, he would have been, condemned. So even though he rejected Copernicus, when he was leaving the room, he said it softly to himself. He stamped the earth and says, "But it moves. The earth moves around, around the sun." But Galileo is saying, Joseph Needham, who is an expert in Chinese civilization, and Chinese science was also quite advanced. But Joseph Needham says that the reason why modern China did not give birth to modern science is because China did not believe in a personal God. Okay, same thing with India in Hinduism. Although there are some schools of Hinduism which believes in a personal God, but a lot of Hindus believe in an impersonal God. And so that's another reason why India, even though in many ways India was way ahead of other cultures in science, but they did not give birth to modern science. It came from the West. It came from a Christian worldview, because the modern science in the West, they said, that God is created, a personal God is created, in a particular way. Let's find out. So that's why they studied the world, and they studied the laws of nature. They said, let's find how God created the world. And then they studied the laws of nature, because God could have created the world in different ways, but He created it in this way. Let's find out how He created. Let's find out how the laws of nature work. And so that's how modern science was born. So I think we Christians should not be afraid of science. I think we should be, So a friend of Vinod Ramachandra, by the way, is a Sri Lankan writer, a theologian, but he is a nuclear physicist. He's a nuclear physicist who writes theology, and one of his friends, who is also a nuclear physicist, he went to China, and he was asked to speak in the University of Beijing. As you know, China, communist, country. Most of the students have been trained for centuries, to believe that there is no God. And so the friend, who is also a Christian, nuclear physicist, he was talking about the history of science, and he was saying some of the things that I just said, and he was saying, and the Chinese students were shocked. They did not know that, it's because of a Christian worldview. They said, we were never taught this. We never heard about it. We thought Christianity is against science. We thought that Christians are anti-science. So he said, they did not. And then he was actually called to talk about nuclear physics. But while talking about nuclear physics, he also talked a little about history. But the students were more interested. When question and answer time came, they wanted to know more about science and Christianity. They're not even asking about nuclear physics anymore. They wanted to, can you tell us more about the relationship between science and Christianity, how it was born, I taught a whole semester theology and science in ASCM, as well as in AGS, theology and science. But when I taught at, ASCM, the seminary in Makati, one of the most brilliant students, the one who engages in discussion, and she says quite a lot of intelligent things, so she was telling me at the end of the class, towards the end of the class, she was saying, "Sir, you need to teach this to our professors." Maybe you should have a 3-day seminar, because in another class, the professor was always saying, bad things about science. And it was she, because of my class, it was she who was defending science. But the professor was always anti-science. And so she said, "Sir," she said, "in most of my other classes, they only say, bad things, When was the last time you heard a sermon on science and Christianity? In a church, this, huh? That's a good, yeah, it's a,
My former pastor, that was 20 years ago, trying to jive science with the Bible.
and in a positive sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, but no, people do that. They come up to prove science with the Bible. But I don't know about your pastor. But people come up with try to prove science and Genesis. Malayan, that's right. So I know people who try to reconcile science with the Bible, but that is, because like there are many people who try to reconcile science and say that, and they try to prove certain things from science by saying that the universe is 6,000 years old. So that's also wrong. So I don't know about what kind of jiving. I also heard about, I also heard about people who try to, bring. But you cannot go to Genesis and try to prove, that the word. So, so again, it's not about jiving. That's not what I'm trying to say. It's not trying to jive science and Bible. That's not what I'm trying to say. Because the Bible is not a scientific textbook. All we can say is a personal God created the world in a particular way. So if you want to know the laws of nature, you don't go to the Bible. You go to science. Yeah, that's right. So I'm not talking about jiving Bible and science. Because the Bible is not a scientific. It's not a scientific. Textbook. But what you you argue with bad science, with good science. So if somebody comes up with a bad science, you don't go and say, but the Bible says this. But you need to argue against bad science with good science, not with the Bible. So you cannot use Genesis 1 either, for or against, against science. All we can say is that God created the universe in a particular way, and and the Bible and science. God is the God of the Bible, and He is the God of nature. So, but if you want to know the laws of nature, you don't go to the Bible. You go to science. If you want to know theology, you go to the Bible. But sometimes people think, that the Bible teaches the laws of nature. If you want to know about subatomic particles, if you want to know about quantum physics, if you want to know about black holes, if you want to know how the stars die and how it's reborn and things like that, you can read the Bible from cover to cover. You will not have the answer. That's not how the Bible works. I mean, yeah, if you want to know about quantum physics, you read the Bible, you'll never get the answer. If you want to know if you want to know about quantum physics, you go to the scientist. If you want to know how to cook, you go to the recipe book, not to the Bible. Huh? No? Yeah, right. You ask John, ask John, yeah. So the Bible tells you to feed the hungry, but it doesn't teach you how to cook. If you want to know how to cook, a recipe book is better than a Bible. So that's not how the Bible works. The Bible is not here to replace the arts and sciences. It's more like a director. It gives purpose for every art, for every science. It gives meaning, to what you do. And that's what the Bible does. But it's not there to replace good science. Of course, there is also bad science. So you argue against bad science with good science. Not by saying, oh, but the Bible says this. So I was in that History Channel episode, they were talking to a Christian scientist, that agnostic, the atheistic guy. So he was saying, so that scientist believes in, 6,000 years. He believes that the universe is 6,000 years. And then the scientist asks him, why do you believe that the universe is 6,000 years? And then he says, the Bible says that the universe is 6,000 years old. Where does the Bible say that? That it's speculation. Yeah.
1,000 years.
One day, yeah, but that's not science. That's not science. That's my point. Yeah. But it's the Genesis never tells. You cannot use that verse to say that the world is 6,000 years, because that's not what it is saying. What it is saying, is it saying that the universe is 6,000 years old? It's only saying that a day is 1,000 years, and it's not even literal. It's just saying, for God, whether it's short or long time, it's the same. No, whether it's short or long, it's the same, because God doesn't live in time. It's not saying that for God, one day equals 1,000. That's figurative. It's saying that for God, whether it's one day or 1,000, it's the same. God doesn't live in time. God lives in eternity, timelessness. God lives above and beyond time. That's the point of that. To say, literally, for God, one day is only 1,000 years. Where do you get that mathematics? You don't get that. So that's not the point. That's what I'm saying. So you read Genesis 1 literally, you read 2 Peter, which says that for God 1,000 days is like one day. But that's not the point of, those words. So he was saying, and so people laugh at us by saying that, this is what. And by the way, this is very important, and I'll just close with that, that sometimes if you say statements that the Bible is not saying, and then when people find out something else, CCF, a few years ago came up with a sermon by Peter Tanchi, I think, like I heard it, in which he said, he gave 3 examples with PowerPoint, where he says about, where he says about 3 speakers, preachers, Billy Graham and Livingston and Von Barron. All of them were at the same time preachers. And the other 2 were even greater preachers than Billy Graham. They used to have bigger crowds than Billy Graham. But then 2 of them went to a seminary, and they lost faith in the Bible. Okay. And then Billy Graham was, he was troubled. So he prayed and says, Lord, I don't want to become like them. I want the Bible to become a fire in my hands. And that's a good thing, that's a good statement, But I think what Billy Graham did not understand, and what the speaker at CCF did not understand, they were actually telling, see what happens in a seminary, and things like that, cemetery, seminary is cemetery, yeah. So they were thinking. But what they forgot to tell is, that the reason the 2 of them lost faith is because they grew up in a church or a denomination where they were told that Genesis teaches that the universe is only 6,000 years old. But when they later found out from science and things like that the universe is not 6,000 years old, so they thought Bible is wrong. You see? Yes, so the problem is not just with those 2. The problem was with the church that taught something that the Bible doesn't teach. There is no, so I was just somebody and he said, that the Bible, a Christian, said that the Bible teaches the universe is 6,000 years old. So I said, can you give me the chapter and verse? It says the universe is 6,000 years old. Can you give me a chapter and verse? So you see that. So be careful. If you say something that the Bible doesn't say, then when people come to hear from other sources, they would believe that the Bible is wrong. That's why they lost faith in the Bible. So we would,